Hello,
Yeah.
everyone. Welcome to the next panel from the EC-ACW, the Early Career Academic Careers Workshop. The topic now is what is expected of faculty candidates. So the faculty hiring process is very complex, and it's something that, as part of an academic career, hopefully you do only once, maybe a couple or three times. But it takes a lot of work and preparation for that one thing. We have our panel today to answer questions you might have entering this kind of somewhat scary part of the process. So my name is Maya Cakmak. I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington. I've been here around 12 years. So it's been a while since I was on the academic job market, but I have, while I've been here, I've been involved in faculty hiring a little bit. We'll give more details in the next slide with our questions. But other things about me, my research area is in human-robot interaction. So I usually, with faculty candidates, I consider myself sort of close in area with folks who are from robotics, sometimes even adjacent kind of AI, machine learning, computer vision, etc., as well as on the human side, sort of the HCI candidates. Um, and then the Allen School here, it's a kind of classical computer science and engineering school. It's not a department anymore. We've grown a little bit. But it has all different areas. So it's not, you'll hear about different institutions having kind of smaller departments that are very focused on one particular area versus we have all of computer science and engineering. Otherwise, I'm also part of Access Computing. So this is how I got into this workshop. This is an alliance, a national alliance, working towards making computer science more accessible for students with disabilities. So that's about me. I'll hand it over to Wing to introduce himself.
Yeah, so my name is Wang. I'm an assistant professor at George Mason University around the DC area. I've been an assistant professor for about 4 years now. I came to George Mason straight from my PhD back in Illinois. Before that, I did my undergrad at the University of Washington, where Maya is as well. I mainly specialize in software engineering research. During my PhD, I got quite a bit of funding and help from the Command-IT organization here, along with Access Computing. So what Maya was mentioning as well, I've been a big part of Access Computing. I am one of kind of at least on the George Mason side, I'm kind of a representative of Access Computing as well. So it's also a good organization, particularly again for those with disabilities or in other kinds of needs. Yeah. So I think Valerie, maybe
Valerie.
next. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you. So I'm Valerie Taylor. So I'm with Argonne National Laboratory. So I'm a division director for the Mathematics and Computer Science Division. And so Argonne is one of 17 Department of Energy national laboratories. And I also have a joint appointment with Northwestern University as well as University of Chicago. And in terms of Command-IT, I'm the president and CEO of Command-IT. And so we're the organizers, along with Access Computing and CASI, of the early career workshops. And so also we're the organizer of the TAPIA conference, which is great. Then I just want to mention prior to being at Argonne, so I've been at Argonne now about 8 years. So prior to being at Argonne, I was at Texas A&M. And so that's where I went to Texas A&M as the department head for computer science and engineering. And then I was also in the College of Engineering in the dean's office. So I served as the Senior Associate Dean for Academics. So a job, I must admit, I was happy to move on from that position. So, but then prior to Texas A&M, I was at Northwestern. And it was at Northwestern that I went through the ranks of assistant professor to associate professor to full professor. And so, and my research is in energy efficient computing, and also using large language models for performant scientific code generation. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Okay, so now I'm gonna move the slide. So the first set of questions are to set a little bit of context so that you might hear different answers to following questions from each of us. So this is kind of the context in which those differences are sort of resulting from. First question, I think we maybe already answered a little bit, but when were you last on the faculty academic job market? So how long has it been since you were on the other side of this? And then secondly, how does faculty hiring work at your institution? So certain things about the process. And then what are some relevant experiences you have related to faculty hiring? This is, given that context of how things work, what sort of parts of the process have you been involved in? And I'll quickly say for myself, as I said, I was on the job market 12 years ago. Maybe part of this, one thing you can also share is other places you might have interviewed. Maybe you don't know the full process, but sort of differences from how it works from where you are. And for me, I will say I was applying both in the US and in the UK because my family is overseas. The advantage there would have been like being closer to family. And that's, I did think that I should mention it because of sort of like how in the US right now, it's a bit unclear. We'll talk about this a bit later, how academic hiring is going to be in the coming years. And there might be more people applying internationally for faculty jobs. So it's quite different there. Basically, I remember one thing was how we had interviews. There were 4 candidates for a position, and everyone was interviewing on the same day. So that's something that doesn't happen here. But anyways, so this was still 12 years ago. Here at the UW, we have quite an involved process. And there's sort of a calendar of how the faculty job sort of works, like the faculty hiring works from our side, but that reflects onto the candidate of what they need to be preparing for throughout. And it's usually in the fall, the call goes out and then applications starts coming in. Around holidays, winter holidays is when we're reviewing the candidates. So we have the full package come in. We are reading the applications, making comments on them, sending them to each other within our faculty to say, take a look at this candidate, etc., and trying to find the people that we're excited about. And then early January, we have committees meet and make decisions about interviews. So who are we going to invite? We don't do Zoom interviews. I know other places do this. I put that as a question there. And so we invite folks for on-site interviews, and then it's multiple weeks, maybe like 8 weeks of lots of interviews back to back. And we do 2-day interviews. And then decisions, so candidates get discussed. We usually have kind of a, without yet quite, making decisions or judging candidates, we present the candidate. So we have the person who hosts the candidate present the same candidate to the rest of the faculty, summarizing how the interview went. And then, discussions start happening and smaller groups might make decisions. For instance, in the area, people might decide that we're not going to push for this candidate. The interview didn't go so well versus we really want this candidate. So that they might continue, like stay kind of in the running. And then ultimately the whole faculty comes together. Sometimes this is multiple times. These are very, very hard decisions. We're usually hiring people intending to have them for a lifetime as colleagues. So very, very difficult decision. And then we start making decisions. The offers go out. And then we might do second visits to convince them to come once we make an offer. And then one question here is who makes the final decisions. Here at the UW, there's a vote, and it's all of the faculty has equal vote. So there's no committee that makes a decision, or the department chair, director, they don't get an extra vote or a veto or anything. So it's really the whole faculty voting. But of course, before something goes to a vote, there's a lot of discussion to make sure all information is out. Yeah, I'll stop there. I'm really curious to hear how it works at your institutions. We can start with Wing.
Yeah, so I can start. So I was last on the job market in 2021. And for those, as a brief reminder, 2021 was also a very unique time to be on the market. It was the first year, I guess, where it was officially COVID, where everything was actually remote. Hiring was also a bit more weird that year. I think there were quite a bit of universities that barely even interviewed, I think, on that year. So there wasn't at least the opportunities was a little more mixed. Some universities hired even more maybe than usual. Some universities kind of barely interviewed or didn't even interview. But yeah, so it was back in 2021 when I was on the market. Um, Maya was talking about kind of briefly mentioning even the locations, right, that we interviewed at. For me, I actually also interviewed, I applied to places in Canada and in Asia as well. So I had two interviews that were in Asia, one that was in Canada in the end, and I've done about four, I think, interviews in the US. So that's kind of roughly the diversity of the places that I've interviewed at. In terms of in terms of being on the other side of making decisions for faculty hiring, I've served twice on a faculty hiring committee here at George Mason, in the CS department, yeah, where I'm at. I've attended about maybe one to about 2 dozen now job talks of faculty candidates here at my institution, along with just the one-on-one meetings that kind of accompanies these job talks. And I've been part of the hiring discussions for, again, about 3, 4 years, ever since I've kind of been here at George Mason. One thing that's rather important also in terms of my involvement here at George Mason in faculty hiring is that we have been trying to hire in the area of software engineering, so the area that I work in for the last few years. So I think that also is a bit more unique, namely that if your area is hiring, typically, even if you're not on the committee, but especially if you're on the committee, it's a lot more involved, at least here at George Mason. So in terms of discussions, in terms of your feedback on the candidates, those typically have a bit more weight than, at least at George Mason, than if it was a candidate that wasn't in software engineering, that may not have been even a focus area for George Mason to have been hiring. In terms of the process here at George Mason, we actually first give out a phone interview, and then we proceed to on-site interviews. The phone interviews, we actually ask a generic list of questions, or at least a standardized list of questions to all the candidates. The college actually gives us the headcount, gives the department a headcount in terms of how many on-site candidates and the type of candidates we may be looking for, in terms of kind of the areas that we would want to be hiring in. And then the hiring committee then kind of selects the candidates for the phone interviews and the on-site. The results from the on-site is then also collected by the hiring committee, and then it's actually shared and presented to the whole department. We then have discussions. Voting also, yeah, is done kind of among the whole department. Unlike what Maya was saying, though, in our case, at the very end, the department chair is the one that kind of has final say on who to actually advocate to the college. Usually, that's actually we do the faculty vote, the faculty discussions, then the hiring committee collects all that information and then presents it to the department chair. The department chair is also part of the discussions, but it's finally kind of cleaned up and presented to the department chair, and the department chair is the one who presents it to the college. But throughout this process, typically it's still kind of whatever the faculty kind of the faculty vote, the faculty discussion. That's typically what kind of the department chair actually presents, and who the college actually makes the offer to. I think that's all, at least answering all the questions on the slide. So I'll turn over to Valerie next.
Okay, thanks. And so thanks so much, Wing, and also Maya. So I'm going to talk about Texas A&M, and there I was department head. So it's very similar to what actually Maya and Wing talked about at UW and also George Mason. And that is, it was where, for example, you have a committee, the committee collects, applications, and that's often your CV, a write-up about research as well as teaching. And at one time it used to be diversity, but now it's research and teaching. And then from that, the package, the committee, it was actually the committee that would make recommendations on the faculty members or the faculty candidates to bring in for an on-site interview. And so during an on-site interview, that's where the faculty member would give a research talk. And we'll talk about this later of what they're looking at with respect to the talk, but then they would have one-on-one meetings, and the meetings would be with the faculty in the area as well as the faculty across the department. But then there's also a meeting with the department head as well as with the dean's office. So those meetings take place during an interview because similarly at Texas A&M, that's where the department head would advocate to the dean's office for the hiring of a faculty member. So it's better if the dean's office has at least met the faculty member. It would often be a short meeting of maybe 15 minutes, but just a meeting with the faculty members. And then, and similar like George Mason, is where the faculty would have a vote on the candidates. And usually the department head, you would go along with the vote of the faculty. It's rare that a department head would go against the vote of the faculty. So that's in terms of what's done at a university. So it's kind of a similar, a few little differences in terms of my experience, in terms of the last time I had interviews, I went through an interview at Argonne, and that's where I had to give both a research talk and a vision talk as a division director. So I had to do both, and I went through meetings very similar to an academic position. When I went for department head at Texas A&M, it was the same, except my interview at Texas A&M, I had to give a research talk that was part of a research seminar. And then second, I had to give a talk where I was leading a faculty meeting and giving my vision for the department. So at Argonne, I had one combined talk that was research and vision. At Texas A&M, I had two talks, one research and one vision. So yeah, a little different. So I think I'll stop there just to give that context. But I've had experience as being a faculty member in the department, just involved in interviews, being on the search committee, as well as being the department head advocating for a faculty hire. So, so I'll stop there.
Yeah.
And just want to see if there were questions too.
I had one quick follow-up about the area. So you said, Wing, you said how you are hiring in software engineering, and it sounded like that came from the college. I'm curious if that's the general way it works. The college decides, and based on what they might decide and how you might argue or how the faculty as a whole might come up with, these are the areas we need to hire. Like what, yeah.
So yeah, that's a good question. I think that I don't think the college actually makes a decision um, on the type of candidates. So I'll clarify there. I think with the college mainly just gives us the head count, if I understand correctly. I think when I mentioned both the type and the head count together, though, that is kind of from the college. In some sense, if there are certain candidates that are super needed, right, for that year, I think I've seen our department chair make the case to the college. That, oh, not only do we want, this headcount that you approved, but we want additional candidate for this because we just lost someone, for example. Like if someone moved, decided to leave in the spring, and we only found that out after the college approved a particular headcount, then we can usually argue for an additional position to replace that faculty member.
That makes sense. Yeah. We also similarly, we don't get a head count. Actually, we get a number. That's the upper limit of how many offers we can make. And I think it's interesting because, of course, not everyone is going to accept the offers, but we have to do a little bit of game theory of likelihood of everyone accepting, worst case, best case. But in terms of area, we have never had a call that specifically named specific areas as priority. But of course, the need in terms of like students, like having so many PhD student applicants who want to work in a particular research area, that's usually a signal for, and then we don't have enough people to advise that many students. We think of that as an area of need. Teaching sometimes comes up, but it's, because we can also hire teaching faculty to cover teaching needs is not necessarily a big factor in sort of tenure track faculty hiring. But yeah,
Right.
it's
And I
interesting.
was going to say, yeah, at Texas A&M, we had areas. We would advertise in particular areas.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah,
Right. And we would always state, we're always accepting exceptional candidates in any area.
I
But
see.
then we would say this year we're emphasizing like graphics or AI or some particular area. And we would at Texas A&M, we would have a certain number of slots per area. So
Mhm.
it was, and sometimes we could make the case that we could change areas with those slots. So we could say, well, it just turned out, maybe we had two graphics and one in AI. And if we got two AI excellent and one graphics, we would change it around. So we would always try to have one area that had multiple. So we could use that as a slosh to go, where we had excellence. So
Yeah, yeah, that's nice. I
Yeah.
do like, we don't do that, but I think it's nice to upfront know a little bit of the priorities so that later on you have an amazing candidate, but we already have so many amazing people in that area. We don't need more. So then all that effort interviewing that person is kind of wasted, right? The argument of like, this was not a priority area should not come up all the way at the end. It's nice to be upfront about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
yes.
that's the case for us at George Mason. So we do have the priority areas and kind of the head count for at least particular areas ahead of time. We do also interview general candidates like what Valerie was saying, or at least these outstanding candidates in general. But that we do have priority areas, and we then our whole search is get a bit more guided towards again either the really exceptional candidates or kind of these targeted area candidates. Um, so I mentioned that I've been on kind of the hiring committee, or at least we've been hiring software engineer for the last few years. Part of that is also because in quite a number of years, even though software engineering was a priority area, even though we interviewed candidates in software engineering, if we don't find a candidate that we actually wanted from it, we've actually passed
Yeah.
on using up the slot kind of. So,
Mhm.
for example, that happened last year. So this year, I'm pretty sure will be kind of listing software engineering as a priority area again, because it was last year and we didn't hire. So we didn't really ever use that slot.
Nice. And then maybe another quick follow-up is we've heard, software engineering at George Mason, and I think it may be safe to assume AI as a priority area in almost, in a lot of places given the funding going there. But are there other areas you can name that are at least at your institutions, or maybe something you've heard from other places that are going to be good areas to, if someone's still deciding, what to focus on, or maybe who to collaborate with, things like that. Yeah, any insights?
Yeah, I can start first. So for us specifically at George Mason, software engineering, we are also looking for operating systems. Um, we are looking for HCI as well. We hired one candidate last year for HCI, but we are looking to grow more for HCI. And I think then even just broadly things like programming languages. Are also another area that we're looking for. I will point out that I think the Talby survey does do a good job on highlighting actually which areas may be kind of hot areas, at least as of the last year, that in terms of number of students graduating and then the number of job positions in that particular area. So for students that want a little more data broadly kind of across the board, I'd also encourage them to check out the Talby survey from CRA.
Great idea.
Yeah, that I just want a +1 on the Talby survey because that gives as a whole with respect to PhD granting institutions what were their faculty needs for the past year, and where PhD students went in terms of particular areas. But whatever area you're in, you're likely to find an institution that's looking in that area. So yeah.
Yeah, it's always hard to predict here, right? Kind of. Yeah. So if you're in a position to choose your area now, it's hard to know in 3 4 years or 4 or 5 years what the market would look like either. So you should use that information with a grain of salt, kind of.
Yeah, and do what excites you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. More importantly, I think yeah, that would be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, because that'll come across in a faculty, interview that you're
Yeah,
excited about the area. Yeah.
absolutely. Okay. Since we already started talking about it, so as part of the first step of the application is preparing all the materials for actually submitting an application. One question, maybe this is, early to think about for some of the students, but for me, I didn't realize how much work is involved in applying for a faculty job. So I'm curious for each of you, like how long did you spend, or how long do you see students these days spending on preparing application materials? And in particular, one maybe tricky part of the application is recommendation letters. If you have any thoughts on, like how did you decide who to ask for letters? What kinds of letters did you ask for when you were applying? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And I don't mind starting in this
Go
space.
for it, Valerie. Yeah.
Okay. And that is, so when I first looked at faculty positions in terms of the application package, I worked a great deal with my research advisor. He he was a big advocate for me going into academia because I wanted to go into industry. And he advocated that I go into academia. So he worked with me on preparing the research and teaching statements that were required. And I also did research into, like, for example, I looked into NSF's 5 year, they often do a 5 year research directions. So I looked at NSF research directions. I looked at DARPA, you can look at their programs. And then I looked at what other ones? ONR and Department of Energy. So I tried to look across because that helped me when I talked about future research. I could talk about it in terms of aligning with future directions identified by like NSF and other funding agencies. So I added that to my research statement, just to show alignment with what I had planned to do. So that helped a great deal. In terms of recommendation letters, I think you definitely need, your research advisor for a recommendation letter. If you don't have the research advisor, it looks very odd. And oftentimes if you worked with someone closely on your committee, you can get another person from your committee. But I tried to get people that I worked closely with in terms of research. And so I worked with industry in terms of my research. And I did get a person that I worked on with research that was a collaborator for a letter, but I didn't get a faculty member for which I just took a course. I looked at faculty that were aware of my research that could add more to the letter than just looking at my CV. So they could add the personal experience. So that's how I identify the letter writers. I was like, I want someone that can add a lot more than what's in my CV, in my research and teaching statements. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can go next. So I'll still go down kind of the list from Maya's slide. And yeah, and I'll kind of add on to some of the things Valerie said as well. But in terms of how long it took to prepare my material, or how long I typically see students prepare, I think it's usually, I guess by the time you go on the academic job market, so the timeline roughly works where the deadlines are mainly at the end of fall. So around December 15th, some starts to be on like November 1st. But most of those deadlines are towards the end of the year. And typically you would spend almost all of fall and even a bit of summer preparing. At least that's maybe what I would think is the majority. That's kind of my experience as well. So
Mhm.
that's typically again a whole semester worth of your time. And that's usually when you aren't even working on any other research projects anymore. So you're not taking classes, no research projects, all 100% of your time during the whole 3-4 months will be purely devoted to preparing these statements, to preparing your website, to preparing your CV, and to even preparing kind of the material maybe for your letter of recommendation writers. Um, in terms of who I got letters of recommendation from, so again, maybe also partly just being in software engineering, but I usually with software engineering candidates, what I like to see, and I think what a lot of people like to see, is actually experience with the industry as well. In terms of a letter actually from, in my case, I got one from Microsoft Research because I was an intern there a few times during my PhD. So actually being able to do some kind of industry work and getting a letter of recommendation there is good. One unusual thing that I still remember one of my co-advisors did was actually to also get a letter of recommendation from someone that I didn't work with. So one that was actually a bit more quite well known in the community in our area. That was just purely commenting on kind of the impact of the work that I've done. So that person was explicitly saying, in the letter that, yeah, this, they never worked with us, but they wanted to comment kind of on the impact of my work. So that's also something I think for students to consider is that it doesn't always have to be someone that you work with. Otherwise, I think I agree with what Valerie was saying, where you want people that you've closely worked with. So definitely having a letter from your advisor, having other senior people, right, that you collaborated with during your time as a student, and then someone from industry, and then potentially this last kind of letter where it's actually someone that you've never worked with, but it's actually someone that knows your work really well. Okay, so you have cited a lot of their work. They may have cited a lot of your work even in their papers. That actually would still be a very good person to potentially consider asking for a letter of recommendation. I don't know if I should continue on the last two bullet points yet, or if we want to
Let me
finish kind of,
follow up
yeah.
just very briefly, and then we can continue. For the letters, I think I will +1 the external letter. It's becoming very common to see someone who hasn't worked with, and it's almost more impressive that, someone like when they've worked with you, you know, maybe you have joint papers, etc. So they have incentive for you to succeed. Your success is their success, versus someone external kind of saying, oh yeah, I know their work. It has had impact. That's almost more impactful. And actually, once you're a faculty member, you go, you know, work a few years, when you're being promoted and getting tenure, that's exactly the type of letter that is going to be needed. So having that when you're applying as a faculty member is a good indication that this person is going to be successful as a professor. So I'm seeing that more and more. And maybe one thing to take that for early career PhD students is how going to conferences, presenting your work, doing a really good job so that people notice you, read your papers, etc., can have kind of down the line be an important thing to get those letters. And then secondly, it's really interesting to hear also that industry letters might matter more in certain areas. In my area, like in robotics, maybe slowly it's becoming something that, like, because industry is doing some things more at scale, there are things you can do with industry collaboration that wouldn't be possible at the university, so that could be a plus. But for instance, in HCI, I don't know that it's very common to do that. Maybe one thing it made me think about is how industry letters can be much more dry and different from what I'm used to from, you know, faculty advisor or other academics writing letters about someone, and they can sometimes focus on, you know, smaller day-to-day things of, like, you know, you had a 3-month internship and you implemented something, etc. And it's not quite like, okay, this person is going to be very influential in the field, etc. So yeah, I think maybe some place like MSR, which is also very academic, I would almost say, like, if you're applying to MSR, you should basically still take all the advice you're giving right now, think of it as an academic institution. But with other internships, maybe you need to have a chat with your intern advisor as they're writing a letter, or maybe even better, if your advisor knows them, can kind of talk to them or mentor them about how to write academic recommendation letters, maybe even send examples of letters they have written in the past to get them calibrated a little bit. Because yeah, with industry job applications are very different from academic job applications, and there might be a mismatch of what's expected in the letter. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree. I'll clarify that when I talk about industry letters, I was referring to industry lab letters too, not
Good.
exactly kind of, proprietary industry company letters. So an industry lab letter, though, for example, from Microsoft Research, can typically comment not only on just your research capabilities from kind of a researcher there, but it would also be able to comment on kind of the impact that you would have made to kind of an industry company, right? So that's kind of the unique angle that would also add, right? If students can't provide a letter of that nature.
That's
Right.
true.
And I just want to bring up too, because sometimes we see at the national labs that we have a number of students in the doctoral program that are here for the summer. So the national labs, like for example, this summer we had, just in computing, in my division, we had 200 students here for the summer. And so, you know, getting letters from national labs is also something good because we collaborate a great deal with academia. So I think national labs are very much too aligned with universities, except there's no teaching. So
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that made me think, Valerie, you mentioned, you know, having someone who knows you well, who have worked closely with you to write a letter, other than your advisor. Again, your advisor is very biased, right? Having that other person who knows you is really useful. And you mentioned one way to get that person is to have them on your thesis committee. And that could be someone from your institution or from an external institution. But another way that I have seen is these summer internships that are more research, like academic internship. And it could even still be that you have your own fellowship for doing your PhD, but you talk to your advisor and strategically you decide to do summer research with someone else other than your advisor. And even I've had examples of this just working remotely. Now that we're so used to Zoom, I've had collaborations with students at other universities where I'm not necessarily on their committee, or maybe I am on their committee, but we work on a paper over the summer, and that gives me a very close glimpse of that person and lots to write about in a letter. Yeah. Okay, so the next questions here in terms of the application package, I think maybe one thing here I want to say to the students is how when the season arrives, we get like hundreds of applications, and not all of them will be asked to read, but it's usually, I might have on my plate 20, 30, 40 at a time. So it's kind of, you have to go through them, give them a limited time, and it's very dense. There's a lot of materials. Yeah, for me, I try to do it across multiple days so that there's no exhaustion. But again, not everybody might do that. Yeah, just giving the sort of the other side of like the thing you're preparing, how it's going to be read. But I'm curious, I can also say for myself, but how is your process when reading applications? What do you look first to decide whether to look further? And what tends to be most important? What tends to stand out for you when you look at packages?
Did you want to start?
Valerie, why don't you start?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, I'll start. So I tend to first go to the statements. Um, so instead of the CV, I go straight to the statements and read about what the candidate has identified in terms of research, motivation, what they're doing and their impact and where they want to go. So I read those statements. Both the research and teaching statements first. And I usually have my notes based on those statements. And then I feel like the CV is there to complement the statements. So then I go back and look at the CV, and you're looking at, okay, what did they put down for their research? What are they doing in terms of their publications? So you're looking at the venues where they're publishing. I also look at um, with the publications, I look at too the list of authors. And oftentimes with the list of authors, I know in the system side, the list of authors, some areas have it alphabetized, okay. But most areas in computing is by contributions. Usually the first author is the main author that's contributed the most with respect to the paper. So I look at where they are in the author list as well. And then sometimes I may grab a paper out of interest, and it gives me also a sample of the writing. Um, so I look at that as well. I tend not to look so much at Google Scholar because I feel like it's early in a person's career with respect to Google Scholar, and it takes time for people to reference the work. So I guess that's why I start with the research and teaching statements. So that's usually how I look at a package, and I'll often, like you said, I do like you, Maya, of trying to read as many, not have much time between reading them. So that way I can do some initial ranking of who am I, and I don't rank them like if I have 20 candidates, I don't rank them like by 1 to 20. I rank them like should be brought in. I don't know, definite no. So I have my three categories. And then I may go back and go, "Ooh, this one went down because this one was really good. Okay, now my threshold, I moved it up, you know. So usually I move them up as move up my threshold as I read the packages. So, and the packages are fun to read. to see what people are doing at different universities. So I don't pay attention to the university until the end. And I go, oh, so this is what so and so's doing. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah, so I'll follow up on that. I do the same process pretty much that Valerie does as well, where I go through the candidates once, kind of separate them into, promising or not, in terms of inviting them. But then I have to go through them again usually. Yeah, and you would have to make a second pass to really, especially if you only have, 4 or 5 slots of people that you can bring in, that's going to change, right? By the time you get to the end in terms of who are the maybe top 4 or 5 that you would want. I will add one more thing that so I don't look at the statements first. Maybe the first thing I like to look at is actually letters of recommendation. Usually I understand that by the time someone writes a letter of recommendation, it's usually good, but there is subtleties in the language, I guess, where people use in letters of recommendation um, that does indicate, right, whether or not a candidate is really exceptional. And so those are kind of things I try to first more easily kind of find in letters of recommendation. And usually that can just be something along the lines that, of all the students, right, that this professor may have advised, the one who's writing the letter, the candidate that is applying is actually the top, 3, 4, 5. And that actually says a lot, actually, if this person has advised kind of, 20, 30, 40 students, and this is actually the top 2, 3 kind of, right, student. Let alone then in those letters, there will be some comparison that may even be drawn between kind of, you as a candidate, and, prior students of that advisor, which usually tells me a lot about the how strong this candidate may be. Then I do follow up with kind of the statements, as Valerie mentioned, and then kind of finally to look at the CV to see kind of the author ordering, to see the publication venues. And that's usually kind of the main criteria I use, right, to come up with a ranking in the end.
Right. So can I ask a quick question? Because it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this until you were speaking, Wing. So we don't get letters at the beginning. We only
Mm.
get letters for the candidates that we want to invite. So yeah, so we
That's
don't, yeah, our,
Mm.
we get the names, but it's not where we say everybody has to have letters. So we get the names and then we send out the request because we say we want to invite them in. So it's very interesting. You get letters at the beginning for all your candidates.
actually, I
Interesting.
mean, we used to do it that way, Valerie. Maybe like 5, 6 years ago, we decided that like it just helps with, because like even having them for an interview is such a big like high bar. And then then we end up asking so many anyways. Let's just ask it from the beginning. It might also have been that another university started doing it and we said, no, we should do it as well. So we might as well.
Yeah, I'll
And
add that we don't always have all the letters. So sometimes it's also a somewhat incomplete picture. But yeah, usually by the time we review applications in January, February, we do have some letters
okay.
for each applicant. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I will add briefly that when I'm looking at the packages, I think in my head there are two questions. One is like, am I excited about this candidate? Would I want to collaborate with them? And that's where, I look at the statement, usually the papers. I also love finding like papers that I can read and learn something about, etc. And then I think the second pass is, can I make a case for hiring this person to the rest of my faculty? Like, how do I convince, if the answer is yes to the first one? And even when it's no to the first one, like maybe it's not someone I'm going to collaborate, but you know, there is like, is this person going to pass the bar for the rest of the faculty? And that's where, it's kind of things like publications where they're first author versus total, like some of the detailed things that you're saying, recommendation letters, like what are some quotes I can pull out from the recommendation letters that are going to help make a case. Like this was one of their top 3 student of this person, and look, the other 2 of the top 3 went to that institution or that institution, or something about impact in the letters, like we were discussing earlier about, look, it has had this impact. So looking for basically making a case for that person, that's definitely a separate look where I need to look at more things. And then Valerie, you mentioned teaching statements. For us, it's something that we want to see, but not quite. Basically, we've seen very weak teaching statements where still it was not so much a factor in deciding to invite or not. And it's somewhat secondary, which, you know, good and bad. And then maybe one question there is, do you have any colleagues who have widely different processes, or like tend to look at something else, or how representative is our answers, do you think, compared to the rest of your faculty?
In terms of the discussion, it's interesting. I think we use similar processes, but in some cases we may come to different conclusions. And it makes for a good discussion. And I think that's where the discussion, it comes up of a person in the area versus it being outside of your area. When it's in your area, you're more critical, and it's expected. I mean, because you know the area and you know the context versus applicant outside of the area. So across the committee discussion, like usually the advocate is in the person's area. And so we generally discuss like by areas, grouping at a time by areas. And it may start off with, a person in that area starting the discussion and then others adding. But yeah. So that's what I found.
Yeah, with application packages, I think I'll ask more about this during in the next slide when we talk about job talks. For the application packages, we're usually, because we get so many, we're usually assigned the ones that are close enough in the area that I haven't seen that many detail, like I haven't seen packages of people like in theory or even programming languages maybe in as much detail in my past experience.
Yeah, I think typically the main factors that would vary. Well, so first of all, yeah, that I agree with Maya's case where we usually are only assigned the ones that are in our own area. So again, especially in my case where I've mentioned for the last few years, I've been hiring software engineering. So anytime any of us software engineering faculties on the committee, we're mainly there to look for software engineering candidates and evaluate that. And I think the only time where we would differ, it's not so much the material that we look at changes, but it's our assessment of it. And the only, I guess, part where we would assess differently is potentially on kind of the importance of a particular topic. Kind of a particular kind of topic within our area. Is that actually a growing area? Is it a hot area? Is it a good area, right, for us to hire in? While everything else is a little more kind of objective. So, this person has this many papers in these publication venues. Typically, we all agree within our own area, right, that this is a good thing or a bad thing. And so the only thing I can really see, within our own area where we would disagree is maybe on topics. Yeah.
Right. Because it's interesting, we had one committee, and so the committee had to come to the conclusion. And even though you were looking at particular area, you would still comment on the area because there may be areas of collaboration and things like that. So yeah, so the discussions were across the committee. So very interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. And then before we move on, one thing I'll highlight is, Valerie, what you said about how you looked at the NSF 5-year agenda and the ONR. I think that's a great strategy. For me, it was kind of really lucky, but just as I was going on the market, the NSF established national, not the NSF, maybe the White House, established the National Robotics Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And then that came out of like there was a 10-year kind of future of robotics, etc. And it really featured my area as one of the big pillars. So it was just, my statement wrote itself. It was very easy, but those are the kinds of things that are really great to kind of seek out, even early on in the PhD, just to be aware of like what others are thinking about, people other than your advisor. All right, so now let's talk about the job talk. Probably the most polished and most worked on talks that we get to see. And I actually really enjoy going to these talks because they're usually very polished. I learn something every time, or at least I expect to. But I'm curious, what do you look for in job talks? And this is where, maybe we can talk more about people in your area versus outside your area. And then if you want to mention like memorable job talks, even if it's anonymous, what stood out, or like why do you remember it so fondly?
Um,
Um,
you want
I
to
can
start?
I can start. Yeah. Um, so I would say that for most of I want to say successful job talks I've seen, usually the first 10-15 minutes and the last 5-10 minutes of them is usually understandable by any CS faculty, and even any CS PhD student should be able to go and understand and appreciate kind of the what was presented. Usually it's kind of right in the middle part is when you get into the really technical details, and that's okay actually that instead of the whole audience, it may only become about 10%, right? The people who work in the area that would really understand that part of your talk. But at least, everything from the motivation to then kind of the problem you're solving, all of those should be things that everyone understands in the way it's presented. And then the last 5-10 minutes where you kind of summarize everything again and actually present your future work. It's important, I think, for any successful job talk for those parts to be understandable by a really broad audience. At least, anyone with CS kind of background. I think Maya was asking about kind of the memorable job talk. I don't have exact one in mind. I have a few though, kind of, and the common theme I see is that instead of always only just presenting kind of either one piece of work or even two, three pieces of work, the one thing I think that always makes the job talk I think feel better for me is if it gives a more holistic view of the person as well. So not just again 1, 2, 3 papers in detail, but also look, like a Venn diagram of some sorts. Okay, for example, that shows these are all the different areas that I've worked in, kind of within, or these are all different topics I've worked in. Okay, in software engineering, this is how they intersect. This is why it makes sense for me to work on these areas. And look, today I'm going to only present kind of 2, 3 of this Venn diagram, kind of 2, 3 papers, okay, or 2, 3 topics, okay, from this Venn diagram. But I think that actually I think is an important part for me in order to come away with the job talk again, not only being impressed by the problem that the person works on and the future work and technical details, but also to more holistically understand that this person understands, the area actually really well, or even beyond the area, right? If it's an interdisciplinary candidate.
Yes, a plus plus on that, on what Wing had to say. And I'll just add one minor detail, and that is to also have at some point in the talk how your work compares to the state of the art in the field. I think, and that is as you go deep in the area, you're also providing the context of your work with respect to others in the area. And you demonstrate that you are aware of what others are doing in the area, that it's not where you're just presenting your work and not aware of what others are doing or duplication. Because I find that's where candidates actually, I've seen talks that are not so well. I hate to say go bad, but when somebody brings up someone else's work and go, are you familiar with this work? And how does your work compare to this work? And a person can't answer that question, we hear about it in a faculty meeting where a person's going, I was surprised they weren't aware of this person's work. Yeah, and especially if that person's sitting in the audience. It is, but you know, it's so important to be aware, in addition to your holistic view, but aware of what's going on in the field.
Yeah, I think in general, in faculty job talks, the interesting thing that I've also learned is there are certain questions you want people to ask and you want, and you have a polished answer to. There are certain questions that you don't. So the one I think Valerie is pointing out here, where even if you do know of that work, you have to make the decision, is that what you want people to think about, in that 5, 10 minutes, right? The last 5, 10 minutes of the talk, for people to think, oh yeah, you didn't, did this person really know of it? And is it actually something that is just better, right? Than this whole job talk. I think this whole you probably don't want, at least in my opinion, you probably don't want people to spend that 5, 10 minutes asking questions about another piece of work that just replaces everything you have said. Yeah. So preempting it is probably the decision, the better decision, right? Or at least to have answered it already with your slides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes,
like,
and demonstrating the difference. Because usually it's the case that even though there may be a big overlap, the assumptions may be different. But it's on the faculty candidate to call out those differences, because in the audience, you know, the faculty at the visiting university may not be aware of all those assumptions, but just a high level view. So it becomes important, like you said, to have that answer or have it on the slide where you're already talking about, here's this work, some of the differences are the following.
nice. Yeah, I agree with everything. I think all great points. I would say for me, especially for outside of area, as Wing said, sort of there needs to be those accessible things and parts. And for me, I like seeing, especially in the beginning, like what is the problem and why is it important? And not just from like, oh, everybody in this field has been trying to solve it for so many years and couldn't solve it. To me, that's not important enough. That like societally, like what is the bigger impact if we solve it? Like what will change if we solve it? Like I do want to connect it to me, not just as a computer scientist, but also as a taxpayer or citizen of the world. So I look for that a little bit. And then for the future work, I get very disappointed. This is also true for the research statement, when the future work is just like the next paper you will write for, like, given, these things I presented, there's like, oh, we can extend it to this or we can generalize it to that, etc. Versus I like seeing like a really bold vision, like something that you say like, whoa, is that even possible? Can like something that's a whole career. So I like seeing those kind of bold visions and thinking like, not just saying, yeah, he can, this person could do this, but more like, is this really possible? Like, are they going to be able to do it, etc. And then other things in terms of memorable talks, to me, when it teaches something, then I'm likely to try to teach it to someone else. So I remember it, like I'm like, oh, I went to this talk. Did you know, blah, 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 something I learned in that talk. Or that, two people, like another person that was also at the talk afterwards, we like, what did you think of XYZ? So we talk about it afterwards. So just things that relate to people in different ways. One nice thing, not a huge deal, but if again, someone in your area is in the audience, it's nice to make the parallels or connect or say, if you're especially thinking about like the related work here, mention that person's name. Sometimes, I see myself and I say, like, oh, thank you. It's a bit of a stretch, but thank you. It's still nice to know that, kind of they're aware, and as a candidate that you're aware of the people you want to work with, what their work is. And then for me, a really memorable ones, as I said, the really bold vision, but there was one particular one where, again, there was a really bold vision in the beginning. This was actually related to fabrication. And the vision was that, like, there's all these, there's, 3D printing, cutting, etc., and interfaces for sort of 3D printing. And one idea was like, can we just directly sculpt 3D objects, right? So that was like, whoa, like how are we going to create machines that like you're as if you're sculpting, you can create 3D objects. And then and I'm like, okay, that's really big, like that's gonna take years. But towards the end of the talk, they had actually have a prototype where it was kind of something where, you were doing something and the 3D shape was changing, and the whole auditorium was like, whoa, like there was an actual gasp of like something unexpected. So the surprise element was nice. Yeah.
That's nice.
All right, great. Let's then move on. Let me check time. We have 20 more minutes. I don't see any questions yet, but again, feel free to interrupt at any point. So then what about one-on-one meetings? So this is where, it's just you and the candidate. What questions do you tend to ask? Do you have a memorable one-on-one meetings, good or bad, the worst thing that happened to you in a one-on-one meeting, or some of the best memorable one-on-one meetings? And then similarly, what do you like to see candidates be prepared to talk about when they come? Wing?
Yeah, I can stand. So at least for me, when I meet with candidates one-on-one, I usually like to just follow up some questions about their faculty job talk. So this may just probably go down to some nitty-gritty details that I probably didn't want to ask during the presentation. I think that's always a good way for them to just get a chance to more relaxingly, speak for something more objective before we kind of switch to them asking questions or just talking about kind of non-technical stuff, right? Which, people are always happy to do that too, I think, but it's always easy to get them just to talk about their technical work, right? Um, so I usually follow up with some questions about the faculty job talk. I usually ask them kind of why they're interested in GMU and kind of what they like about it, just to get kind of a better picture even for myself if I were to go pitch this candidate to the committee or to the rest of the faculty, to know if there's any kind of personal connections, to know kind of how enthusiastic, right, this candidate really is at trying to get an offer. Because everyone that's interviewing usually tries to get as many offers as possible. Then they really show kind of how interested they really are, right? Once they have kind of all the offers at hand. And as a school, right, you want to make kind of the least amount of offers and have as many, of them accepting, right, as possible, kind of. I also like to ask usually kind of what kind of classes they're looking to teach. I guess Maya was asking kind of, what is something that's gone wrong with these kind of questions? So I asked this, recently even to a candidate. So this was an interdisciplinary candidate with software engineering and NLP. And what was interesting to me is that the candidate answered as if they wanted to teach NLP, courses. They told they answered the question that way. But the reality is they were interviewing actually as a software engineering candidate. And in many ways, I think the candidate probably should have known that they were interviewing as a software engineering candidate. But because they actually answered, that in fact, that they even said more than that in the sense that they said that they want to teach NLP courses, and that kind of they weren't too interested in teaching much of they wanted to be thought of as, an NLP person. They wanted to teach NLP courses. They wanted to kind of be thought of as an NLP candidate. But in the back, actually, that person was actually a software engineering candidate, was going to be a software engineering slot for that candidate. And so that actually worked quite negative, I think, for the candidate, because of the way the candidate answered questions that way. But I think more importantly, I usually in these kind of one-on-one meetings, what I like to see the most from the candidate is not so much the answers to my questions. I want to see actually the candidate kind of use this opportunity to present how interested they are in me kind of as a colleague and in the university itself. And so usually that comes in the form of, at least from the candidate side, that will be kind of looking into kind of who I am, right? The work I do, and then asking me something kind of, interesting or intellectual, right? Whether it's honestly even personal or, about my work, right? And then discussing maybe some collaborations. That's actually, I think, the most valuable part of maybe the time I would spend with a one-on-one candidate. Yeah, that doesn't always happen, but it's usually the one-on-one meetings that blows my mind are the ones that actually have kind of that component.
See, and I'll add more from a department head perspective, okay? Because here's the part that comes up in a one-on-one meeting with department heads. And that, while you're focused on the research that you're doing, I think the teaching becomes important. But I also want to add is knowing your needs for a startup package. Okay. So usually during my, as a department head, I would ask, so do you have any unique needs, as a faculty member, so, and to give you an example, so one time, we were interviewing in the graphic space. And so the person we interviewed was doing motion capture, which meant he needed space to do research in motion capture. You need a motion capture lab. Um, and so I think being ready with questions such as that about what are some of your, if you have unique needs, that's a good time to raise them as well. Because if you're doing work in let's say in the motion capture and they tell you we don't have any space available. If I'm the researcher, I'm scratching that university off the list because I can't get the research done. So you want to have some idea of your needs in terms of a startup package. You don't have to have the details about what's needed with a startup package, but having some idea of the unique needs for your research to be productive. And it's a good time to take stock as you start to finish your PhD of what you would need such that you can hit the ground running at the next university. So I'll stop there and not spend time on the details. But I think that part is important. And I think, in the individual one-on-one meetings, in addition to the university interviewing you, you're also interviewing that university. So if there are things you want to know about the university, such as, like I do work in high performance computing. So I asked questions around collaboration because I don't do work just by myself. I collaborate with the different science domains. I'm asking about computing resources that are available, etc. But you want to ask about a little bit about the culture, to say, is this a good fit for me with respect to collaborations or things? For me, it was like, are things done in a silo? And so that aspect, I did ask quite a bit of those questions. So know a bit too about what's important for you. And you'll get to know that as a PhD student by what works well for you during your PhD. And I use that to say, I want a complementary type environment where I'm going than to have to start from scratch. And if you don't mind starting from scratch, that's fine. But know, like how big are the groups in your research area? What are their future plans for growth in that particular area? What are their priorities? So use the one-on-one meetings and especially the meeting with the department head. I would often get asked questions, what's the vision of the department? So when I went to be a department head, I had to adjust to having now the vision of the department. And I go, here's what I work on. And they were like, no, I I don't really care about what you work on. I want to know the department. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I'll just give one example. Um, because even before I became department head, I think I went back for a visit after I got the offer. And so Bjorn Strustrup, who's the inventor of C++, you know, was looking at coming to the university. And so I just happened to see him in the same hotel, and we were meeting for, I wasn't meeting with him, but we ran into each other at breakfast. And the first question he asked, "What's the vision that you have for the department?" I was like, "Really?"
Yeah,
So,
it's really nice to have that perspective from you,
yeah.
Valerie.
So feel free to ask those questions to figure out if a place is good for you. But yeah, I was after meeting Bjorna, and I was like, I soon became um, aware that I had to have my vision as an elevator pitch um, for the department. I was like, oh, I was kind of you know, ready for my pitch as a researcher. He goes, well, no, he's like, because you're the division, you're going to be the new department head. So what's your vision? Where do you see it going? How much growth do you have? You know, and I'm saying I haven't accepted yet, but so I'll stop there.
That's great. Yeah, I'll just plus one everything that was said. I also like sort of following up on the job talk, although sometimes our job talks are on the first day, but in the afternoon. So sometimes you're meeting with the candidate before they have given a talk. So I'll usually ask like a really quick version of it. And then I like pushing on. I like also asking about like behind the scenes, like how did you come up with that? Like who gave you that idea? Where did you get that idea, etc. That might lead to stories a little bit, as well as the future. Like I asked, what you're most excited about. And then something that didn't come up earlier in the talk, and as well as in the one-on-one, just trying to see the excitement, like that they are really passionate about the topic they're working on. Acknowledging that, people have different levels of expressivity, like they might be super passionate, but still maybe like not necessarily smiling about it but yeah, I think you can kind of tell people's excitement. And then, Valerie, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the process that some candidates are asked to meet with the dean as well. In our case, we have a student meeting. I think most places do. And students, they're in our case, like they're quite harsh. Like they actually go really prepared to these meetings, and they really want to hear certain things from the candidates. And even though, they're not in the room where we're making decisions, their reviews matter a lot. And it's in the next slide how those meetings go behind the scenes. But there have been cases where students had raised certain types of concerns that were taken very seriously. Yeah, I think candidates also need to think about how to talk differently with students, or what questions to prepare to ask the students. And then on the flip side, students can be quite honest about things like, is this a collaborative environment? Is it easy for you to have a co-advisor and things like that? So they're also a great source on the flip side of information about the culture and sort of how the department works. All right, so last few minutes. This is the kind of behind the scenes of the decision. Any things you can share that kind of demystifies how decisions are made at your institution, what gets talked about, both positives and negatives. Things like, you mentioned earlier, Wing, how the fact that a candidate mentioned themselves that they were not necessarily what you were looking for, things like that. Yeah. Wing, do you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, I can start. I think that the overall theme I can think of in terms of answering this question is just fit within the department. And that can range anything from the teaching that the person is interested in doing, to the actual research work that they have done, to then even more specifically the fit within an area. So if you're really overlapping a lot, right, with a particular person already, in terms of the actual topic, right, within an area, that actually may not be great, although I've seen it work both ways where, it doesn't work, it doesn't help the case, but in some sense also sometimes can be pitched positively and helps the case. But I think, yeah, at least in bit within the department is just a bit on how you are as a person. Does it seem like, you're someone people want to work with, right? Or have as a colleague. So that's kind of how social you are, how good you are at kind of chatting with people. But then it's just kind of, yeah, the courses you may be teaching, is that something that the department is looking for? And then it's kind of the research work, right? Your fit, particularly within the area.
And I'll just and I think Wing summarized it very well. I'll just add one thing we look at too was how well the person answered questions. And that is because the comments were, depending on how they answered questions, would also is an indication of their teaching style within the classroom in terms of questions from students. And so I remember one time it was an exceptional researcher. The research was great. Everybody was engaged, but it was just this big difference in terms of answering questions that I, it was just like when he answered the question, you didn't understand what he was talking about. And everybody felt this way, like, yeah, you just go and you like, and so you could tell because people didn't ask a follow-up question. It was like, no, no. After the second question, people were like, no. And it was this look of do not ask any more questions. Let's let this go. No, no. So it a lot of attention was given to how people answer questions with their research talk, in addition to what Wing had to say about the research talk and the collegiality aspect of it.
Yeah, very similar for us too. Something that happens that is maybe might be unexpected is we actually sometimes go back and ask letter writers more detail, more clarification, especially if there's certain concern from maybe outside area folks that like the people who are advocating hadn't thought about. And then, we can have an answer, but then when it comes from an authority that's a bit more strong. So there's between meetings, sometimes there's a lot of background homework that's done and phone calls made to kind of get more evidence to further support a candidate. And at times this is people who were not necessarily even letter writers. So people who are well known in the area might be contacted to ask, like, do you know this person? What do you think about them? Which is, again, a bit unexpected and scary. And usually, it's trying to find more positive. It's not about trying to find negatives. And sometimes people will say, no, I don't know them, but it's not their fault, right? It doesn't pull anything down. It's just trying to find things to push people up. Yeah, otherwise, ultimately we do votes. And when it is down to, let's say, like 2 candidates and we have 1 spot, sometimes that vote is like multi-stage. So there will be different polls of like ranking. Like if we had 2 spots, would you want both? Or are you still really just your first choice, et cetera, et cetera? And then try to stare at the data and then decide what to do. And then our department chairs over the years have been really skillful at like sometimes we end up with 1 spot and 2 candidates we wanted, and they'll go back to the dean and beg and get another spot. So yeah.
Yes.
All right. And then maybe for the last minute, we could say any advice for PhD students. I think we've weaved that in throughout a little bit, but any specific advice, especially in the current climate, maybe with the some of the potential challenges.
Um,
Yeah. Oh,
go ahead.
yeah. I I don't know how to answer the first bullet point because it's hard to predict, the future. GMU should be hiring this year. I know that, and particularly probably still in software engineering. But at least the last bullet point, I wanted to focus a bit on that in the sense that I think the most important thing, and we talked about kind of application packages and so forth, right? But to me, actually, the most important thing is not even in the application package. It's actually just your name, kind of. Do I know your name? Have I known you before already? Especially again, if you're in my area. If you're not, then it is what we discussed, okay? But if you're in my area and I don't know you, it's already a bit of a disadvantage, admittedly, for that candidate. So the answer actually I want to give for that last bullet point is actually just kind of strong networking. And that's obviously from one of the most easiest places to do this is conferences. But the other thing that I like doing now and I encourage at least my own students to do is actually to visit other universities and give talks even when they were students. Um, this is a piece of advice that I give that I didn't do much myself, admittedly, when I was a student. It's hard, kind of, I think. But the more people know who you are, it makes a huge difference, I think, in at least for my case, I think, in terms of you being hired. If people know who you are, they've known your work, they've seen you mature kind of even as a student, that has a huge effect, I think, on them advocating for your hiring as a faculty. And so I think as PhD students, one of the most important things to do is actually to go and visit other universities and give talk. And this could be as simple as you're traveling home or you just have a layover, even in some sense, a long layover in a particular city. It's not a bad idea to just go give a talk. Usually what I do with my students is I don't pay exactly for the whole trip to go to visit another university, but if they go visit on a particular day, at least per diem, kind of their meals and their transportations, I would even try to advocate for them being reimbursed. So I would try to reimburse them at least for that kind of cost that they would incur during those days. But yeah,
Yes.
it's essentially networking and extending to just giving talks and visiting other places.
Yes. And I just want to plus one and just to add, with giving talks at other universities, if you're giving a talk at a conference about a paper, it's very easy to take that talk, extend it with more details, and give it at a local university, and your advisor can help you to facilitate that talk at the university. It's very easy to arrange a seminar. So just want to plus one on that aspect because that helps to get your name out. And also, while we focus on conferences, don't overlook workshops because while workshops are small, it gives you a chance to have more in-depth discussions with people at workshops as well. So that's all I have to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus one for me as well on networking. I was also going to add the workshops. And one thing is going to the workshops, maybe presenting your work there, but also you could think about organizing workshops. So these usually, it's an opportunity to work with people. I mean, your advisor might still be involved, but you could just email someone and say, do you want to organize this workshop on this topic we're both interested in? And it might, the topic might change, etc. But it's a great way to work with someone. And then, of course, as an organizer, then you will be announcing the workshop. You will be, seeing all the papers that come in, etc. So you get to interact with your research community of like even smaller interest, like common interest group very closely. So plus one on that. Then I would also say, conferences like Tapia, where it's not necessarily, of course, like people in your area should know you, but it's also really useful when someone outside your area says, oh yeah, I've met them. Like, so that's where, Tapia, maybe the grad cohort, things like that for students early on can be really valuable. And then the last one I was thinking, this might not be possible at all universities, but back at Georgia Tech, when I was a grad student, I would help a lot by giving demos to visitors. So this would be famous people coming to give talks at Georgia Tech. And then I would tell my advisor would ask, can you give a demo while we're doing a lab tour? So I got to meet so many people that way when they were visiting my university. So it's kind of, it's a volunteer, like extra work and break in the day, etc. But it definitely has that networking return. All right. And with that, we're over time already. Looks like we had a lot to share. I don't have any questions, but I'm sure, if anyone who's watching the video or on the call, if you contact us, we'll be happy to answer more specific questions in the future. And with that, thanks very much, everyone.
And thank you, Maya, for well-organized questions
Yeah.
and facilitating the discussion. And Wing, it's always great to see you. So yes, so thank you
Very
so
nice
much.
to meet you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Maya, and likewise, Valerie.
Yes. All right. Thanks so much. And thank you, Tamika, and also Shannon with facilitating. And we hope everyone you have a great weekend. So thanks, Andre and Joe. Let us know if you have any questions. Okay. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you much. Thank you very much for the great panel discussion. This was really, really helpful. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.